to the rapid push across occupied France, American soldiers faced the sobering prospect of doing battle against Nazi Germans on German soil. Instead of joyful citizens welcoming the long-awaited liberators, they would enter bombed-out towns as the spoilers of Hitler's dreams. Who knew what dangers lurked, what problems would emerge, as soldiers advanced across the sacred soil of the Nazi fatherland? One thing, though, was certain. The fighting would intensify. The programs you are about to see pick up the progress of World War II from autumn 1944 through the early winter months of 1945. Allied soldiers are now advancing from France and the Belgian Low Country east towards the city of Aachen and then forward into the German Roer Valley. The front lines resulting from this offensive will be one of the broadest ever and place the Allies on the very border of Germany itself. As you will see, the long supply lines will require clever transportation logistics and will, in the end, be as important to the outcomes of battle as any tactic employed on the ground or in the air. Produced at the end of World War II, these official documentaries convey a sense of time and place that modern documentaries simply cannot recreate. We present these programs without any editorial intervention whatsoever. First, however, some dramatic still photography from the Allied push into Nazi Germany.
Army tanks blast the Nazis from towns bordering on Nancy prior to the fall of that important French city on 15th September. After a 2-hour barrage, infantrymen continue their advance. Nancy is on the right flank of Lieutenant General George S. Patton's drive on Germany. It controls the main road running along the northern slope of the Vosges Mountains to Strasbourg on the Rhine. Some 40 miles southeast of Nancy, French armor moves in for the cleanup around Épinal, capital of the Department of Vosges. On 12th September, they approached the town of Vittel, a famous French watering place, and attacked German points of resistance. French troops who moved up from the south for a junction with Allied northern forces helped to narrow the pocket of Nazi retreat through the Belfort Gap. 30 German tanks were knocked out at the village of Dompierre. American aircraft cooperated with the 2nd French Armored Division. German prisoners bury their dead after the occupation of Dompierre, 14th September. initial crossings of the Reich frontier, First Army units attacked Siegfried Line fortifications. Infantry troops pressed forward, supported by intensive cover fire. General Hodges' advanced patrols move on the west wall emplacements. On 16th September, rapid passage is made after combat engineers cleared a lane through Dragon's Teeth. At the point of deepest penetration, the breach of the line in the Aachen area is widened to about 17 miles. Anti-tank ditches are part of the barriers in front of the main fortifications. A captured pillbox. American firepower has been able to pierce most of the heavily reinforced emplacements encountered along the rim of the Siegfried Line. Formations of Dakota aircraft fly over the town of Geel in northern Belgium after completing missions near the Dutch frontier. The flights coincide with the Allied airborne invasion. One of the planes has been hit and is gradually losing altitude. The crew bailed out. Other Second Army troops passed burning wreckage en route to Eindhoven for the junction with men of the 1st Allied Airborne Army, who landed on the 17th. Eindhoven was captured soon after the 1st American paratroopers touched Dutch soil. All important bridges in the area also were secured. Entering Eindhoven, where they pick up some of the American troops, the British push on northward toward Nijmegen. They cover the 33 miles in 5 hours and reach the outskirts of Nijmegen at 1200 hours on the 19th. The important bridge across the Vaal River was kept intact. A regiment of the U.S. 82nd Airborne Division crossed the river in assault boats to overcome the German defenders. Explosives were already in place for the destruction of the span. British engineers removed the charges. Seizure of the bridge without mishap constitutes an important victory, for without it, the Vaal River would have been a formidable obstacle. British armor passes over the bridge as the Allies continue the drive aimed at cutting around the enemy's defenses before northwestern Germany. Vast shipments of supplies are brought up close to the lines as the hour for the new Western Front offensive nears. A railhead company sets up a Class 1 food supply dump with enough provisions to feed 1 million men for 1 week. Here, artillery ammo is buried in caches along roadways pointing toward the front. The hollow U trenches protect the shells from artillery fire. Advancing units can replenish their ammo stocks from these roadside ASPs without undue halt. On the Third Army front, the drive to the Saar has given impetus with the elimination of the fortress of Metz. In this action, Mézières-les-Metz, north of the city, is being fired upon from emplacements at the Hermann Goering steel mill. Elements of the 90th Infantry Division are ready to enter Mézières-les-Metz. Final shelling of the town is directed by the 7th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. Inside the battered town, the medics evacuate engineers who were wounded while demining the area around one stubborn point of siege. Metz and its outlying forts constituted a formidable obstacle before which the Third Army had been held up since mid-September. The gradual collapse of Metz defenses terminates the French city's long reign as Western Europe's strongest fortress. Infantrymen take cover as they move through the streets, alert against snipers who may have been left behind by the retreating Nazis. A typical fort, strengthened by the Germans after its capture from the French. Active resistance in Metz ended 22nd November. Renewed First Army activity on the Hürtgen Forest front, through which our troops have been fighting since crossing the German frontier in September. Tanks paced the advance of an infantry division. Fighting in this wooded terrain is southeast of Aachen, where a new Allied drive begins on 16th November. The British 2nd Tactical Air Force prepares barrage balloons, which will be floated along the front lines of the 1st Army sector. They'll form a bomb line to designate location of our own troops during the aerial assault preceding the move-up of ground forces. 15 balloons will go up for this purpose, with a spare inflated on the ground in case one is shot down. Beginning at 11:15 hours on the 16th, bombers of the Allied Air Forces, escorted by fighters, dropped thousands of tons of fragmentation and incendiary bombs on fortified positions east of Aachen. The air attacks continue for 1.5 hours. The ground forces begin their drives at 12:45 hours, aiming at Düren and Jülich on the Ruhr River line before Cologne. The attacks are launched jointly by the 1st and 9th U.S. Armies. North of these troops are the Tommies of the British 2nd Army. The advancing Americans encounter extensive fields of ingeniously placed mines which impede the progress of men and machines. Combat engineers clear and mark the mined areas. The forward push is a case of half a mile and half a village at a time. Flanking movements bring our troops into the backyards of small dwellings, where they take advantage of whatever natural concealment is available. The 1st and 9th Army lines swing forward on a tight 25-mile front, as many small towns fall in the face of the opening push. The 3 American armies of the 12th Army Group have now taken approximately 400,000 prisoners since D-Day. In the fighting near Breinig, Germany, medium tanks add their 75mm guns to the artillery barrage. Their long-range coordinated fire against German positions facing the First Army is directed like field artillery from tank command posts. Ammo is stacked up near the tanks as the crews await the order to open fire. The city of Aachen was taken by the 1st United States Army on 21st October 1944, after a battle that raged for nearly 6 weeks. Out of this heap of rubble, the 1st Army would fashion its base for the next major Allied offensive. This was Aachen the day after its fall. The job of rehabilitation would not be easy. The chief rail station would have to be repaired. The electric power plant was out of operation, as well as the natural gas facilities. The military government section went to work, establishing order, restoring communications. The telephone system, for example, was salvaged when a former official of the company disclosed the hiding place of the city's telephone diagrams. Another problem for the AMG, food for the local population, was partially solved when hidden staples were discovered and hauled to a refugee camp outside the city limits. German civilians were pressed into service for this and other tasks. Soon Aachen was so well restored that refugees from the nearby internment camp were allowed to return to their homes in the city. This suburb of Aachen then became a rest center for the men of the 3rd Armored Division, where they had their first chance to relax since D-Day. A meal like this, for men long accustomed to cold fare, was a source of genuine pleasure. All up and down the line, rest centers were established throughout the First Army's area, stretching from Aachen to the southern tip of Luxembourg. At these, the men found relief after their drive across France and Belgium, and gathered the breath needed for their next offensive. Meanwhile, at the front, local actions characterized the pre-offensive period, in the south and in the north. Along the German border, while we were attacking an observation post, the distant church steeple, German mortars hidden nearby tried to knock out our battery, which continued to fire, making its mark. In the center of the First Army front, a local operation was being prepared at this time to precede the main drive. Although the attempt failed temporarily, the orders were to break out of the Hürtgen forest and attack toward the Roer River and the Cologne plain beyond. The 28th Division was assigned the task. It was to launch a 3-pronged drive toward fortified towns controlling key roadways. In preparation for the attack, miles of roads had to be built through the heavily wooded area where the division had previously been pinned down. This section, near Aachen, begun late in October, was by the first week in November carrying American military traffic to and from the front. In other parts of the forest, another kind of preparation was underway, protection against the cold. Bivouacked close to the front, the men attended to last-minute details and took care of personal needs. The preliminary drive was launched on the morning of 2nd November, as men of the 28th Division, cautious, alert, moved through the woods which were alive with Germans. In the initial push toward Schmidt, our men fought steadily on, against an enemy that was unseen but ever present. The same morning, another regiment opened its attack in the center of the drive, directing its fire toward Vossenach. Our Air Force was up that day in support of the ground forces. The 3rd Spearhead, meanwhile, moved off as planned on the northern flank of the drive in the direction of Hürtgen village. The men continued to advance for 2 more days in the face of mounting counterattacks. We took a lot of prisoners. Some of those captured in the northern push were rounded up for evacuation to the rear. Still more Germans poured into an assembly area in the south, where they were questioned by one of their number and segregated according to their former Wehrmacht units. The stream of prisoners continued to mount until early in November the First Army registered the total captured since D-Day. Units of the 28th Division continued their action in the Hürtgen Forest against opposition so stiff as to make advance impossible. We held our ground with light artillery and anti-tank guns. With ready ingenuity, an abandoned tower was strung with telephone wire and converted into an observation post as we made a second attempt to take Schmidt. From here, the order to fire was transmitted to our tanks hidden in the woods below. And then came the snow, blanketing the front a week after the drive had started, adding the final difficulty to those under which the 28th Division was fighting. The men had to dig for protection underground in order to hold their hard-won positions in the Hürtgen Forest campaign. They had to struggle not only against a well-nigh impregnable enemy, but against the elements as well. In view of the unfavorable circumstances, Major General Leonard T. Giroux, commander of the 5th Corps, ordered on 9th November that the preliminary operation in Hürtgen Forest be called off. Guns were cleaned, oiled, and covered as the campaign drew to a temporary close. To meet the needs of swelling numbers of Allied troops on the march into Germany, the First Army opened a supply depot in Liège. This was designed to be the largest of its kind in the European theater of operations. It was only a part of the extensive preparations being made for the main drive. Anticipating the demands of the coming offensive, signal and communication facilities also were expanded, from rear areas forward. New transmission equipment of various kinds was received, installed, and put in use. Protected against air attack, the Hadir Steel Works at Gieferdanga, Luxembourg, taken over by the Supreme Command a month earlier, were providing the First Army with another essential need: heavy steel for construction and repair. The plant was run by the United States Corps of Engineers, who checked the finished beams before shipment to the front. Lumber, too, was needed. Sawmills in Luxembourg and in Germany were taken over and run by our engineers. Board planking like that used on the Hürtgen Forest roads was produced at this mill to build the roads that would lead us to Berlin. We had to repair and sometimes rebuild the bridges destroyed in the Battle of Belgium so that materiel could be rolled forward over the network of rivers. One of the bridges over the Meuse was restored so that again traffic might flow. Special equipment for our armored vehicles. A new type track connector was installed to better grip the mud under the tread of the 3rd Armored Division. A method of coping with Siegfried Line fortifications was devised. Our men found that the Dragon's Teeth could be effectively buried with the help of a tank dozer and some mud. Worn vehicles, which had already seen heavy duty in earlier campaigns, were being reconditioned to perform their part in the new offensive. The same snowfall which had halted operations in the Hürtgen Forest campaign augmented the problems of preparation and supply. Behind the lines, the tempo was accelerated as truck convoys rolled eastward in a continuous stream, building up a vast accumulation of food and equipment as the hour for attack approached. On 16 November, the First Army struck to clear the area to the Ruhr in the direction of the Cologne Plain. The main effort of the First Army's drive would be borne by 3 divisions of the 7th Corps. They would move north of the forest and along the superhighway from Aachen toward Düren. This part of the operation would be carried out in 2 parallel drives.
The 1st Infantry and 3rd Armored Divisions would thrust eastward through Mausbach, while the 104th Division would push north after clearing Stolberg. The morning of the attack, on the outskirts of Aachen, barrage balloons manned by the British were floated eastward to mark the line of enemy positions to be bombed. This was the first time that barrage balloons were used for this purpose. Later that morning, our planes came over, bombers and fighter bombers, British and American. They softened up the tough road that the 1st and 9th Armies would follow in their joint attack to the Ruhr. Our strategic bombers struck the key city of Düren, straddling the Ruhr River. Düren had been converted into a strong point by the German High Command to compensate for the loss of Aachen. The civilian population had been evacuated. The buildings were forts, storehouses, and billets. No advance to the Ruhr or beyond it was possible without the neutralization of Düren. We dropped a saturation load that day, chiefly fragmentation bombs and incendiaries. They set huge fires, the smoke from which was visible for miles. Scanning the skies to note the end of the air raid, ground forces waited for the signal to attack. All armor was put in readiness. Camouflage nets were removed. The color plaques mounted on their vehicles served to identify them to the air forces. This reconnaissance group was scheduled to lead the 104th Division's drive through Stolberg. Following the briefing shortly after noon on 16th November, the 1st section moved off to deploy along the road for reconnaissance. The following day, ground troops of the division stood by, waiting the order to join the attack on Stolberg. They advanced along a forest trail in a flanking movement, designed to relieve pressure on 2 of our battalions which had been pinned down inside the forest. Assault guns of the 3rd Armored Division covered their movement from positions bordering the line of attack. The result of German counterfire. One of our battalion command posts near Stolberg was completely knocked out by a direct artillery hit. Several American soldiers were wounded. The debris was so heavy in some places that one of their vehicles was buried up to the windshield. German townsfolk were injured by their own guns. This woman and other civilians received first aid from our medics. On 19th November, the 9th Air Force flew through heavy flak in support of the 1st as well as the 9th Army. 1,600 planes attacked frontline defenses that day. They strafed the Germans dug in at Stolberg, who were holding up our advance. Fortified houses surrounding the town were peppered by our machine gunners. And they were being hit by heavy guns like this M12, which could be speedily maneuvered under its own propulsion. Massed 3rd Armored Division tanks acted as artillery to pour in volley after volley of fire. And this at last cracked the defenses of Stolberg. The town was left to the remnants of the civilian population, who were beginning to taste the meaning of war on their own soil as they moved their belongings out of the battered city. Stolberg was finally cleared on 21st November by the 104th Division. The town had been strewn with booby traps and mines. In some cases, it was necessary to blast structures which could not otherwise be cleared. Two weeks later, the American flag flew over the city. While some units were busy cleaning up Stolberg, others had pushed north to enter Eschweiler on 20th November. This was the largest German city between Aachen and Düren. Quiet on the exterior, the city was alive with snipers. Mopping up began at once and continued for 2 days. Prisoners ferreted out of their hiding places were gathered into the net. In other parts of the city, the hunt for holdouts continued. Some of our infantry cruised the city streets on tanks as they searched out the enemy. By the end of the second day, we had virtually cleared Eschweiler of all its defenders, and our men were able to look forward to a dry night's sleep. Roadblocks like this, where the enemy had dynamited an overhead bridge, were rapidly cleared by our engineers. As a seal of victory, a military government unit arrived to take over the city's administration. On the following day, the attack pushed on from the outskirts of Eschweiler toward the next town to the east, Weissweiler, which fell to our troops 2 days later. As the line of attack pressed forward, we approached Frentz, which lay across the Indi River. With all roads leading to the town under German fire, and with all bridges blown, our engineers had to bridge the river in order to enable the division to advance. An hour and a half after construction had started, the first jeep raced across the completed bridge. The attack on Frentz progressed rapidly as heavy artillery was brought up to the line, and on 28th November, the town was ours. The 104th Division hammered at enemy defenses for another 5 days, fighting its way across the Indi River to take 2 more towns, thus carving off 4/5 of the way to the Ruhr. Meanwhile, in the Mausbach area to the south, rockets launched the 3rd Armored Division's drive to the river. They blasted the opening wedge for this attack that would move eastward in a parallel line. This was the first time that rockets of this kind were used by the First Army. 75 launchers loosened 600 projectiles in a single volley. In the first 30 minutes of the attack, they fired 1,800 rockets. Immediately following the barrage, a task force covered by our tanks moved out from Mausbach toward Gresenich, their first objective. German guns got the range on the column and knocked out one of our vehicles. But the column continued to move ahead under the protection of our tanks. Lined up in artillery array, they flanked the advancing task force and rained fire on the enemy in Gresenich. The enemy, however, held us outside the town for 2 days. It was essential to keep a constant stream of armor moving up and forward. While some elements were struggling to advance, new units were brought up to the line. Every tank, every gun was needed, so that the 3rd Armored Division could operate effectively in the center of the drive, supporting one infantry division on the north and another on the south. Men were needed too. Troops of the 1st Infantry Division were moving up through the forest near Aachen to break the enemy defense lines, separating us from the Ruhr. They were on their way to Gresenich. Using a ruined factory as an observation post, the attack was renewed. From this vantage point, we could shell and hit the Germans entrenched inside the town. From the edges of the forest, our men moved forward to exploit the work of the artillery units. Continuing to advance until late that day, they finally captured Gresenich on 19th November. Following up the advantage, our armor pressed forward, opening an attack on Werth, another strongly defended town. During one phase of the operation, some of our tanks had to move out over the open fields, where the tanks themselves were the only cover for our infantry. German counterfire was strong and accurate, hitting the lead tank and wounding its commander. Approaching Werth from another direction, men of the 1st Division entered the town, which was under enemy mortar fire. We had to fight for Werth, every inch of it, hugging the buildings for protection, hunting out snipers concealed in the shells of houses, ducking into ruins for shelter. Despite the tough resistance, however, the fanatic foe at last surrendered, and by the evening of 19th November, Werth too had been secured. For the next 2 weeks, the First Army continued to advance, fighting through the almost impregnable wall of closely spaced German towns which had been skillfully fortified and bitterly defended. Towns like this one, Hammich, which the 1st Division captured on 20th November and from which it pressed. On the march to the Ruhr, these troops moved ahead to punch their way through the next ring of towns blocking their path to the Ruhr. Food and ammunition kept rolling forward despite the handicap of weather. While the main effort progressed in the Stolberg-Eschweiler area, the 4th and 8th Infantry Divisions renewed the previous offensive in the Hürtgen Forest. On the northern fringe, the 4th Division pushed off on 16th November. With field guns supporting the action, this second attempt to clear the Hürtgen Forest got underway. Our men, advancing through the woods, were sometimes scattered by enemy fire, but they kept on going, inching their way forward. Sometimes they were pinned down, but they crawled ahead. Casualties were heavy in all parts of the forest, but they received prompt attention from our ever-vigilant medical corps. Communications and heavy armor were brought up to support the infantry further up the hill. The advance continued successfully as the 4th Division drove on towards its objective, the town of Großhau, where it crushed the last German resistance on 28th November. With continuous artillery support, this division was able to fulfill its assignment in the Hürtgen Forest campaign. The 8th Division joined the action by attacking objectives in the heart of the forest. Supported by one combat command of the 5th Armored Division, it launched its drive on the morning of 26th November with a rocket barrage. The rockets were firing at enemy positions in Kleinhau. It was estimated in the field that one such battery equaled the light artillery power of 5 divisions. Air support came the following day, when fighter bombers flew more than 1,000 sorties over the area. Then the artillery took over, concentrating on the target at close range, and 2 days later, Kleinhau was captured. Hürtgen too was finally cleared and secured late in November. One of the major objectives of the earlier campaign, Hürtgen presented a shell-shattered face to the weary men of the 8th Division who had battled for the town. Turning south, the division moved on to take 2 more towns, Brandenburg and Bergstein, and then they proceeded to mop up the remaining German positions between them and the Ruhr River. At last, these troops had a chance to relax. They had succeeded in clearing the Hürtgen Forest, and by 8th December had established one sector of the First Army front along the west bank of the Ruhr. Troop replacements were effected during the first week in December when the First Army paused before completing the drive. The 9th Infantry Division, fresh from a rest center in Belgium, moved up. It was on its way to relieve the battle-worn 1st Infantry Division, which had been in continuous action since the drive began. As the convoys passed each other, the 9th moved forward to take up positions at the front. Relief and relocations were also taking place in other areas during this brief lull in the fighting, as the First Army gathered the strength needed for its final leap to the Ruhr River. One thrust of the new drive was launched early on 10th December from this town, Lückeburg, which had been hotly contested. Attacking through Inden, we began to close in on Pier. On 12th December, after days of stubborn resistance, Pier showed the effects of the battle for its possession. The 104th Division moved on to wipe out German resistance along the west bank of the Ruhr north of Düren. At the same time, the 3rd Armored Division pushed through another string of German towns defending Düren, separating the First Army from the Ruhr in this area. It opened the attack on 10th December by shelling Schlich, one of the remaining strong points west of Düren. Men of the newly arrived 9th Infantry Division went into action in close coordination with the 3rd Armored Division. Objectives in Schlich are visible in the distance. Following the artillery barrage, armor and men moved forward with a new piece of equipment, a rotary mine exploder. While the column pressed doggedly onward, infantrymen rounded up some of the enemy whom they found hidden along the path of advance. Up ahead, our men had to dig for what shelter they could find. The lead tank had been hit. The fire spreading caused a series of explosions. Meanwhile, gunners at closer range continued the attack, pouring in a steady stream of fire until late in the day when the ceasefire order was given. Resistance in Schlich was quelled. The following day, 11th December, those defenders who had survived were assembled for questioning and inspection. The next objective, the strongly defended town of Geich, was already aflame from German and American shell fire when the 3rd Armored Division bore down upon it. Men and guns moved out first. A smoke screen was thrown up to cover the movement as the heavy armor swung into line. As the men entered the town, they found it wrecked and empty of human life. In other parts of the town, the fires burned on unchecked. They gave concrete evidence that the 3rd Armored Division had cleared the enemy from still one more section along the 1st Army front. Simultaneously, from the fringes of the Hürtgen forest, the last of the 3 final drives got underway. Armor moved up and forward to strengthen and broaden the attack. Infantry of the 83rd Division, recently brought up to the line, were marching toward the last objective in this campaign, a suburb of Düren. By 13th December, we were driving the enemy ahead of us, pinning their backs to the river. The attack to clear the town, Gerzenig, began the same day. Our infantry was alert to sniper fire from the enemy, hidden and protected. In some parts of the town, resistance was so great that it was necessary to blast the Germans out of concealment and to hunt them out individually, both inside the city and on the outskirts. Among those taken prisoner were a number of women who had been collaborating with German soldiers. As our men rounded up the remnants of the fanatic forces defending the Ruhr, they were bringing to a successful finish the tough campaign launched a month earlier from Aachen. The First Army had won through to its objective and stood ready to pursue the foe in the next phase of the offensive into the heart of Germany.
By the first week in October 1944, Allied forces had liberated most of Western Europe from German occupation and had established a continuous front from the North Sea to Switzerland. The 9th Army was assigned positions north and east of Aachen on the extreme left flank of the American forces. At this point, the 9th Army consisted of the 19th Corps only, composed of the 29th Infantry, 2nd Armored, and 30th Infantry Divisions. After fighting north of Aachen, these divisions began the preparations for the Allied offensive to penetrate the Siegfried Line in mid-November. A rest camp was established at Kerkrade, near the German border in Holland, approximately 5 miles behind the front lines. The 30th Division arrived at this camp during the first week in November to rest before the start of the new offensive. Originally assigned to the First Army, this unit landed in Normandy, participated in the drive across France and Belgium, and took part in the fighting around Aachen. This was their first rest period. A recreation program was provided, but the men were free to spend their time in any way they wished. Most units were assigned to the camp for 48 hours. After this brief but welcome relief, the men returned directly to the front. On 10 November, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, inspected 9th Army troops accompanied by Generals Bradley, Simpson, and McLean. General Eisenhower first visited the 29th Infantry Division at Eigelshoven in Holland. With Major General Charles Gerhardt, the division commander, General Eisenhower talked to enlisted men from the front lines, complimenting them on their work. On the same day, General Eisenhower visited the 30th Division at Herzogenrath in Germany, just over the Netherlands border. The division commander, Major General Leland S. Hobbs, greets General Eisenhower and Lieutenant General William H. Simpson, commanding general of the 9th Army. By 8 November, the 84th and 7th Armored Divisions had assembled in the 9th Army area, and with the 102nd Infantry Division became a new corps, the 13th. On 16 November, the 1st and 9th United States Armies thrust eastward in a coordinated attack from Aachen to the Roer River. The final objectives were the Cologne Plain and the industrial area of the Ruhr. In preparation for the attack, 9th Army troops destroyed Siegfried Line pillboxes and similar fortifications captured during the fighting for Aachen. Lead wires and an electric detonator were used instead of a fuse. This pillbox west of Aachen was blown by the 246th Engineers. Other preparations included converting a muddy field into an alternate route through the town of Übach. The road net throughout the area was thus improved for military traffic. A Class 1 supply dump was established in the area at Maastricht, Holland. When completed, it would contain enough rations to feed 1 million men for a week. Ammunition was carried by train to Herlen in Holland, a railhead 10 miles northwest of Aachen, and unloaded there directly onto Army cargo trucks. These transported the ammunition to a forward dump along the Aachen Road. Captured Dutch collaborationists unloaded the trucks. In Übach, a field artillery battalion laid telephone lines from its battery to headquarters. Wire was strung off the ground because of weather and traffic conditions in forward areas. A German plow drawn by a GI truck provided an improvised method of digging a ditch in which a multi-strand cable was buried. This was used for more permanent communication systems. The area confronting the 9th Army and over which it would have to fight was flat, arable farmland with little natural cover except for scattered clumps of trees. The countryside was dotted with small towns and villages, frequently not more than a mile or two apart, and consisting of old, solidly built stone houses. The enemy had evacuated civilians from the area and entrenched himself in these villages, which constituted excellent defensive positions. Field fortifications included the pillboxes and earthworks found throughout the depth of the west wall. Knocked out enemy tanks, bomb and shell craters were evidence of the heavy bombing that had already occurred in this area. During the preparatory period, action on the 9th Army front was limited to artillery fire and small-scale attacks and counterattacks. An observation plane of the 29th Division prepared to take off from Schinveld in Holland. The plane directed fire on targets near Geilenkirchen, Germany. A battery of 105mm howitzers fired as directed by the plane. At Ubach, to the south, a field artillery battalion of the 2nd Armored Division softened up the enemy. This barrage included smoke shells, which marked the targets for our aircraft. The 9th Army's mission was to clear the area in its zone between Aachen and the Roer River and protect the 1st Army's left flank. Objectives included first Aldenhoven and then Jülich. The 30th Division, reinforced by a regiment of the 84th Division, advanced in a general southeasterly direction to the Army border and then became Corps Reserve. The 2nd Armored Division, supported by a regiment of the 102nd Division, seized the Gerionsweiler area with one combat command. The rest of the division advanced to an assembly area northwest of Jülich. Starting at 1100 hours on 16 November, 12 squadrons of fighter bombers of the 9th Tactical Air Command attacked the initial objectives of the 19th Corps. In addition, medium and heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force made successful runs over the communication centers of Lurken, Aldenhoven, Linnich, and Jülich. Shortly after the cessation of bombing, the 3 divisions of the 19th Corps took off on 16 November on their drive east toward the Ruhr. On 15 November, the 3 divisions of the 19th Corps began assembling for the attack. Men of the 29th Division, supported by the 2nd Armored Division, moved through and out of Ubach toward their rendezvous at Beggendorf. Beggendorf was the jump-off point for the general drive to the Ruhr. Tanks were assembled a mile west of Beggendorf in a shallow valley to avoid enemy observation. Following the air and artillery bombardment, they came out of concealment to begin the attack on 16 November. The tanks deployed over open territory as they advanced. They moved through Beggendorf toward their initial objective, Loverich. Supporting infantry of the 2nd Armored Division followed after the tanks. Although it had been in our hands for some weeks, Beggendorf was under heavy mortar fire. As tanks and men moved out from Beggendorf, they had to advance over bare fields with little cover and under constant artillery and small arms fire. Early in this attack, prisoners were taken and marched to a field behind the lines for examination. The Germans were sent back to Beggendorf, which served as a gathering point for many of the prisoners taken during this action. The 2nd Armored Division, supported by a regiment of the 102nd Division, took Loverich in the first 2 hours of the action on 16 November. The town was still under heavy mortar and artillery fire the day after its capture as troops and equipment passed through. Beyond Loverich lay more open fields and more difficult fighting. Troops of the 29th Division, brought up to Loverich for an attack on Setterich, about 2.5 miles to the southeast, moved out toward their objective on 18 November. Meanwhile, to the south, the main strength of the 29th Division was battling for the town of Basweiler, which had to be cleared before Setterich could be attacked from that direction. The troops used small arms and mortars in house-to-house fighting. Wounded men were given first aid before being evacuated to the rear. Breaking from the cover of houses on the fringe of Basweiler, a battalion of the 29th Division deployed for its attack on Setterich to the northeast. A barrage consisting of white phosphorus and smokescreen shells was laid down by mortars to cover the advance launched shortly after noon on 16 November. Heavy artillery fire was encountered by troops that had almost no cover. First aid men moved out to pick up the wounded and bring them into Basweiler for treatment. Tanks of the 2nd Armored supported the 29th Infantry Division as they moved out of Basweiler towards Setterich. More prisoners were taken during this new action and were brought into base Weiler as soon as possible. After examination, the prisoners were herded into trucks and transported farther to the rear. Enemy mines delayed our armor on the base Weiler-Setterich road. Setterich had been severely damaged by artillery fire and air bombardment. Infantry and vehicles moved ahead toward Setterich. On 18 November, our troops entered Setterich and by the end of the day had cleared 2/3 of the town. Units from all 3 divisions of the 19th Corps were in Setterich at the same time. In addition to the 29th and 2nd Armored Divisions who had fought for the town, men of the 30th Division moved through Setterich to assist the 2nd Armored in its attack on Freildoven, next town to the east. These troops left Setterich on 19 November. They advanced over open fields toward Freildoven, the outskirts of which they reached the same day. Freildenhoven, shown here from the air, was overrun and occupied by our troops on 20 November. Meanwhile, due south of Setterich, the 29th Division launched a parallel drive eastward. Infantry utilized captured enemy trenches in their advance toward Bettendorf. Bettendorf was entered by our troops on 18 November and the town fell the same day. It immediately became a base of fire against strong enemy resistance. Prisoners taken in and around Bettendorf seemed stunned by the 9th Army drive. 1,034 prisoners were taken during the first 3 days of attack. Seersdorf, about a mile northeast of Bettendorf, was captured on 18 November. These air views of Seersdorf suggest the damage suffered by the town. Aldenhoven, taken 21 November, was equally hard hit. Aldenhoven was the first important objective reached by the 29th Division, marking the halfway point on the road to Jülich. Here, 2 medics of the 29th Division look over the remains of a church, in front of which men of the 81st Tank Destroyers set up a 3-inch anti-tank gun. A wire liaison team laid communication lines along a street in Aldenhoven. While the 2nd Armored and the 29th Infantry Division were battling eastward, the 30th Division, reinforced by a regiment of the 84th Division, cleared Würselen, a town to the rear, on 19 November. Würselen had been the scene of bitter street fighting in a local engagement several weeks prior to the 9th Army's general attack. Men of the 84th Division paused during a mine-clearing detail to eat their noon meal. Every object suspected of concealing a mine had to be carefully checked before the area was considered cleared. Medics gave first aid in plasma to a German civilian whose leg had been blown off by a mine left by the Nazis in a backyard. While probing the ground where the civilian was hit, one of our engineers stepped on a second mine. The engineer who set off the mine lost his foot. By 18 November, a regiment of the 84th Division and the British 43rd Division was poised for a joint attack from 2 directions against the German city of Geilenkirchen. Led by flail tanks, the British bore down on Geilenkirchen from the northwest through an area evacuated by enemy troops and civilians. The British division was equipped with both American and English armor. Sherman tanks, manned by British personnel, participated in the attack. The 43rd Division passed through the German town of Gangelt, just across the Netherlands border. Outside Gangelt, the tanks and accompanying infantry deployed to continue the advance over more open terrain. The British action developed into an encircling movement. Troops fanned out to cut off the approaches to Geilenkirchen and to gain the advantage of high ground to the north. Both vehicles and men took advantage of what scattered cover the terrain afforded. Beyond Gilrath, only slightly more than a mile from their objective, Geilenkirchen, self-propelled artillery and massed Sherman tanks laid down a barrage. Men of the 8th Battalion of the Middlesex Regiment threw in harassing fire to support American infantry attacking from the southeast. Men of the 84th Division under British command and covered by British fire closed in on Geilenkirchen. In this area, some 700 yards southeast of the town, about 300 enemy mines were found. Infantry advanced past deactivated mines. The Americans fought their way forward to the approaches of the town. Having overcome initial enemy resistance, they marched on Geilenkirchen. Meanwhile, British units had resumed their progress toward Geilenkirchen from the northwest. They passed through the broken town of Bauchem, a suburb of Geilenkirchen. American infantry and tanks of the British division entered Geilenkirchen at dawn on 19 November. Moving through the town, the advancing troops experienced sporadic enemy fire. The use of loudspeakers to urge enemy troops to surrender, one form of psychological warfare, was used by the 9th Army for the first time at Geilenkirchen. Some 300 Germans surrendered in response to the broadcast message. The prisoners attended to their own wounded. Many other Germans were ferreted out of buildings and taken prisoner. Geilenkirchen was captured by 1200 hours and finally secured by 1400 hours on 19 November. In cleaning up activities, engineers deactivated an enemy demolition charge placed under a bridge by the Germans before withdrawal. Communications were established as soon as the town was secured. After some of the most severe bombing and artillery attacks of the war, Geilenkirchen presented a scene of devastation that followed the pattern of Aachen. An Allied military government was established and notices posted in English and German. The weather deteriorated on the 20th, the day after Geilenkirchen fell. This bad weather continued for the next 5 days and hampered operations all along the front. Despite the weather, British troops and armor moved out of Geilenkirchen on 21 November and advanced northeast towards Worms. The British used flail tanks with much success to discover and detonate mines in this area. The column included tanks of the British 79th Armored Corps. On 19 November, American troops of the 84th Division, also moving northeast, entered Sugarloaf, jumping off place for the joint attack on Worms. By the 28th, however, all towns west of the Roer and Inde rivers, with the exception of western Jülich, had been captured. On the 29th, with the southern two-thirds of the 9th Army front parallel and close to the Roer, the 13th Corps attacked in the direction of Lindern. Beek and Worms were in the line of attack. On 29 November, United States troops of the 84th Division moved out of Sugarloaf to take up positions facing Worms. They established a line of mortars 100 yards behind the front. Armament, ammunition, and supplies were all carried forward by hand through the mud. Slings were used to pack the mortar shells. Sniping was common, and troops advanced cautiously. Mortars were placed in defilated position. The mud made evacuation of the wounded even more hazardous than usual. Jeeps rigged to carry litters proved helpful. Meanwhile, in the advance on Beek from Oppweiler, the mud was equally treacherous. Maintenance of communications became a major problem. Water, rations, and mail were carried by hand to men of the 84th Division entrenched north of Oppweiler. These men were an advance element in the drive on Beek. This sector was under artillery fire, making it difficult to get the wounded back to a point where proper medical attention could be given them. Just south of Beek, a field artillery battalion of the 84th Division utilized large concrete pipes found in the area to improvise shelters. These afforded protection against German shelling of the reverse side of hills. The 102nd Division pressed on toward Lienich, Rohrdorf, and Flossdorf. the 7th Armored Division supported the advancing troops as needed. To support the 102nd Division's attack on Lienich, tanks of the 7th Armored Division moved out from the vicinity of Garionsweiler. The 102nd Division and the 7th Armored Division entered Lienich late on 1 December, and by 2400 hours held 2/3 of the town. The following day, the entire town was cleared with the exception of a small number of snipers. Men of the 102nd Division moved on the double away from a church steeple that was drawing enemy fire. Moving through Lienich, troops of the 102nd Division on 2 December captured and cleared Rohrdorf, south of Lienich on the Roer River. On the same day, Flossdorf, another river town further south, was also entered. The capture of Rohrdorf and Flossdorf allowed the 13th Corps to capture the Roer River and to achieve its objective of clearing the west bank of enemy troops. Heading east from Kostler, the 29th Division and tanks of the 2nd Armored Division struck out for Hassenfeld-Gut. Hassenfeld-Gut lay a mile north of Jülich, which can be seen in the distance being shelled by our artillery. The fighting for the Gut was so prolonged that the infantry regiment assigned to capture it had to be relieved after 6 days of constant effort without obtaining its objective. This man lay in a field for more than 5 days after being wounded by our artillery before he was found by our first aid men. When the isolated buildings of the Hassenfeld-Gut were cleared, the defenders proved to be of mixed quality. Many of the German casualties and prisoners were mere boys. The 115th Regiment of the 29th Division finally cleared the territory the 8th of December. While resistance at the Hassenfeld-Gut was being neutralized, a parallel and equally bitter campaign was waged for the Jülich Sportsplatz on 8 December. This also fell to the 115th Regiment. On the day after its capture, the Sportsplatz, consisting of 2 football fields and a nearby swimming pool, was inspected by officers of the 29th Division. In crossing the broad expanse of the Sportsplatz, our men had not only faced the defending garrison, but heavy enemy artillery fire from locations across the river. By 14 December, the 30th Division, coordinating with the 1st Army, cleaned out the Inde-Rohr Triangle. Swollen to 3 times its normal width by rains, the Rohr presented a formidable barrier to both men and equipment of the 9th Army. However, on 15 December, all territory west of the Roer was under Allied control, thus completing another phase in their drive to the final objective, the defeat of Germany.
Thanks for watching this video from the U.S. Military Channel. We invite you to like, share, comment, and subscribe today.